It's Sunday, April 15th, 2018, and this is the Product Mentor Talk. Today we're joined by one of our mentors, Patrick Hoffman, Senior Product Manager of Enterprise over at Udacity. He's going to lead a talk today on sprints, finding and maintaining the right cadence for your team and product. And so let me just briefly explain the format. The people you see along the bottom of your screen here are our mentors and mentees within the current session of the Product Mentor program, where we pair people up all around the world in the area of product management to make better product people, better product decisions, and once in a while, a better product along the way. So everyone wave hi, say hello. Look at that, they're all waving hi, except for those frozen people. Yes, we dipped them in ice. So let me just we'll quickly go around with introductions. And as you introduce yourself, say who you are, where you are, and whether or not you're a mentor or mentee. And I'll start with the person closest to me, and that is Steven.
Hey everyone, I'm Steven. I'm a product manager at Tailwind in New York, and I'm a mentee to Kyle Wendling, who works at Foursquare.
Excellent. And next up is Patrick. Patrick.
I'm Patrick. I'm a mentor to Anthony, who's down in LA. I'm currently based in San Francisco and other parts of the Silicon Valley and working at Udacity.
Outstanding. And over to, I can't read your name, Nargis, I hope I said your name correctly. Or approximately.
Hi, I'm actually also a product manager, but I'm not a mentor or mentee. I'm Patrick's friend. So I'm here to hear from the community, and I'm interested to always learn more about product management. So thanks for having me.
All right, and do remember to leave your video on. And with that said, I'm going to go over to Hannah. Hannah, go ahead.
Hi, I'm a mentee to Jordan. I work out of New York at a company called Vitals. It's a B2B2C.
Excellent. And over to Esley.
Hey, I'm Esley. I'm a product manager at MBO Partners, which helps independent contractors, and I'm in Washington, D.C., and Andrew is my mentor.
Great. And Ellie?
Hi, I'm Ellie. I'm a mentee, and I work at Franklin Energy, working on energy-saving products.
Anthony.
Hey guys, I'm Anthony Lazarus. Like Patrick said, I'm a mentee. I am a product manager at a contract furniture manufacturer called Sit On It Seating, and I'm located in Los Angeles.
Andrew.
I'm Andrew Hsu. I'm working out of New York, and I'm at a company called Vega Factor, where we help companies build better habits and higher performing cultures. It's been my pleasure to mentor Esley for this semester.
And Alberto.
Hey, I'm Alberto Simon. I'm based out of New York, and I'm a mentor to Ellie, and work on a few products, but Payability, which is a fintech startup that helps advance payments to small businesses. So.
All right, and a little bit about me. I am Jeremy Horn, aka the Product Guy, and I'll be moderating here today. Post your questions up to the Q&A section at theproductmentor.com/live or to the YouTube area that says live chat. Post your questions up. As long as they're topically related, we'll pass them along to our speaker, Patrick, today. Fairly real time, so you get your answers right away. And for those of you maybe asking things a little bit off topic, a little bit more generic, we will still pass them along to Patrick. I just might wait till the end of the talk. But with all of that said, and without any more ado, let me hand it over to Patrick to take it away for his talk on sprints, finding and maintaining the right cadence for your team and product. Take it away, Patrick.
Cool. So I kind of want to talk today about sprints, which are kind of a critical part of Scrum, which if you're working in the technology side, you may have heard about it. Whether you're a PM or working with engineers, designers, Scrum's a large topic that folks tend to hear about, and sprints as well. And so I really want to focus on a couple core areas, what sprints are and how to understand them and across different companies, what Scrum is in terms of it as a tool, what to look out for. And this is actually kind of the key part here in that I'm focusing on cadence, and that the cadence is actually an overlooked multiplier for what you can get out of Scrum and out of this whole process of sprints and teams. And making sure that you have the right cadence at the right time for your product and team, as well as the company, is really a critical thing that in my years I've seen a lot of PMs overlook. And so as a PM, like, your driving goal, besides, bringing a great product to market and making your customers happy and bringing value, there is also, really to have a successful team, because by having a successful team, you'll be able to do all those things. You'll be able to produce work of high value, and, work of high value equals happy customers, paying customers, which means you continue to both have a job and get to go and experiment on new crazy things that you might not be able to otherwise if you didn't have that revenue coming in. And so Scrum's a good way to get teams to deliver high value. Scrum's one of many agile methodologies that are out there. And its focus is really on reliability and repeatability, really all about that machinery. So who am I, and why the heck do you guys even care what I have to say on this? I've been working in technology startups now for about 7 years, a little over 7 years, in some pretty complex areas. Prior to moving out to the West Coast and joining Udacity on the education side, I was working in spaces that go by names like software-enabled hardware. That would have been our robotic wheel over it. Super pedestrian, that enabled people to get electric assist just by slapping it into their bicycle. And so that's a highly complex thing. You've got the embedded firmware, you have the actual physical hardware, you have the manufacturing processes, you have things as simple as your e-commerce site and how you make sure to communicate whether or not a product can get to somebody in time. Lots of moving pieces. And so lots of different teams, lots of different Scrum teams, and teams also not following Scrum who had to be interacting with Scrum teams. And prior to that, over at Social Bicycles, which is now Jump, getting acquired by Uber, building all of that and really introducing Agile, introducing product management to a team that hadn't really thought of those things, hadn't thought of how to make sure that what you're building is bringing value to a customer and that you can ship things iteratively in order to get that out there. So beyond that, I did tech and product development prior to those roles, and I also continue to do some freelance product management for folks based in the US, as well as other areas like China and the Middle East. So lots of different exposure in terms of product types, whether it's the hardware platforms, just simple mobile apps, but also the business models, B2C, B2B, B2B2C. I've done business to government as well. And really products and companies as they go through different stages, the introduction, growth, maturity, as well as decline, which are really relevant in terms of thinking about the right cadence you need for those different phases that your product is in or that your company is in. So what exactly is a sprint and why you should care? So at its simplest, a sprint is the key to the Scrum framework. And it's really just a big bucket, a container for all other Scrum events, things like your sprint planning, your daily Scrum stand-up, your sprint retrospective, your sprint demos. All of those things are just events that are placed into this bucket of a sprint. And the sprint, the whole idea of it is that it's a chance to inspect and adopt something in your workflow. And the word sprint is really, it's simple, right? It's like, hey, it's this bucket, it's this thing. We're going to do all these events and it'll make sure that we deliver things of value. And depending on your experience, it can have different meanings to you, and depending on the company, it may mean different things. And so because of that, it's really important when you're a younger PM or when you're a PM joining or parachuting into a new company that's quite kind of up and running, to get a handle on what they actually mean by sprint in their scenario. Are they doing all of it? Are they only doing some pieces? Do they actually do a sprint retrospective, or do they only do retrospectives once a quarter? All of these things are left to the team to determine. And it's important to make sure you understand what you're rolling into, but also what works for you and pay attention to what's working for you and your team and your company at different stages. And so, the sprints in Scrum are generally considered to be most appropriate for products where you need that workflow inspection, that adaptation. And that's also a point that many people overlook. If you're working on a product that maybe older school, so it came out of software in the 90s, and a lot of waterfall people were trying not to do waterfall. They didn't want to spend thousands of hours building a product, get it to market, and have it just flop because it's completely out. This goes back to points some other people making earlier about, hey, even now we're using sprint methodology and Scrum methodology to validate ad copy and to validate what words we're using on our website prior to going live, making sure that it actually resonates with our customers and brings the most value to them. So really, it's all about iterative value, incremental work, and across all the different projects and companies I've worked at, it's definitely the norm in software technology companies. It's less common in hardware companies that I've worked at, and it's really rare in a lot of the higher end research type places. So it's great to understand what sprints are and that they fit into Scrum, but really, if you don't fully understand that Scrum piece, you may not be able to bring this value to what you're working on. So Scrum originated in the 90s, came out from a bunch of leading software engineering groups and product people out in parts of the Valley and other areas. And its whole focus was really to help teams and to help the teams become more empowered than they had been, to make sure that the teams were getting value, because when people are, working a lot of hours and then they ship something and they find out it brings no value, it kind of makes you question what you were working on and why you were spending all that time doing that. And so Scrum was this idea of a way to solve this, and to let you tackle these highly complex problems, which, back in the 90s, software starting to take off, the bubble starts happening, a lot of more complex problems are happening, or you get into server-side architecture of software and really interconnected apps, right? So just like I had with Social Bicycles and Jump, where you have a mobile app and you have server-side and you have kiosks, you have embedded software at the bike, you have the physical experience at the bike of unlocking, locking, communicating, but also the product side of how you integrate with the city and make sure that you've got all the policies lined up, that they're not going to just roll in and rip your bikes off and throw them away. So really lots of complex pieces you have moving, and you want to make sure that at every single point you're able to both bring value and continue to ship something of value. So at its simplest, it's super easy to understand Scrum. It's meant to be a lightweight methodology that you can apply in, but it's also incredibly difficult to master. And in many ways, it's difficult to master because it actually, it's highly deterministic, and it expects you to follow rules and put in place rules that you can kind of implement across your company. And it can be challenging for some companies to want to adapt or to want to pull in this more strict methodology, particularly early stage startups, where they kind of been doing it without realizing they're doing it. They just ship, and they go and they talk to somebody, hey, is this worthwhile? But as you scale, sometimes those processes don't evolve in the same way they want them to. So, it's simple. You got that backlog, you go ahead and you create a sprint backlog. That sprint backlog can be, then you go into sprint planning, you figure out, hey, what are these stories? What are the tasks associated to make sure that, my definition of done is actually delivered, that at the end of this period in time, I know that I can say this is done and it's done because of X, Y, Z, and it's going to bring value to the customer in ways A, B, and C. So typically the way I've seen this done, most companies just by default end up at 2-week sprints, and then with 1-day cycles in between that. And potentially into that 2-week sprint, you have something shippable, but many times these days you don't. You have processes that go longer and longer, and you'll have things of incremental value that you can ship, but not necessarily something that you're shipping out to a customer. And this has been both good and bad as I've seen it. It's great because Scrum is formulaic, it's predictable, what's going to be going on, and you kind of, the same way that if you were to go to a movie or a book, there's a really clearly defined story arc, and Scrum has that. In a sprint, there's a clear sense of built-in rhythm, that certain things will happen in certain orders in order to achieve things, and that those regularly occurring sequences just help the team not worry about how to do their work and instead get to actually do the work of value. And the critical thing is that there are other elements that happen outside of the sprint that you have to keep going, whether you want to, have a design team that's running and producing work that engineers can consume and actually make worthwhile, copywriting, et cetera. There's a lot of pieces that can also be done in their own sprint in a separate team. And it's worth noting Scrum tends to work best when in teams of 3 to 12, but there's definitely points where one team can't unfortunately be fully independent, which was the goal of Scrum, is that a team could be independent, could do all the work they need to do. And what I've definitely seen in my time as a PM is that very few teams have that luxury. If you're a small team inside a much larger company, you're dependent upon other aspects of that company and products being released, or also changes coming that you don't anticipate and you now have to adapt for and make sure that they don't negatively influence your customers, even though they were positives for the rest of the customer base. And so really the core thing here is that I want folks to take away not thinking of sprints as being only 2 weeks. And this is for a number of reasons. Scrum, if you were to go and get Scrum, go through training for Scrum, they'll talk to you about sprints being anywhere from 1 to 4 weeks. The 4 weeks is a relatively arbitrary upper cap, just set because they're informed by that principle that they want to ship, and they want to ship early and often. And so if you were to do those, 4 weeks, you'd end up with 12 sprints in a year and only 12 points at which you're getting feedback from your customers in the market of whether you're bringing value. You get down to 2 and you're ending up in that 24 period. And so you could break this wall and go the opposite way. Definitely companies that are more in the hardware and analog space, they will end up having 6, 8 weeks in between, simply because certain manufacturing processes take long enough that you won't get to see any feedback for that period in time. And you could also go the opposite way, kind of down, and say, we're only ever going to do 1 week sprints. We want to have value coming out every single week. And in general, though, most teams just say, no, we're going to pick this happy medium. We're going to do 2 weeks. It's the right period in time. 1 weeks are too fast. Everything else is too slow. But when I've seen teams working in the 2 weeks, they often get really hung up on the sequential nature of a sprint and the regular routine. And at the worst case, they end up using Scrum and its methods to say no to work, as opposed to figuring out whether they're working on the right items that are going to bring value to their customers. They'll instead, so they may not work as well with PMs or with other teams to make sure that what they're bringing is of value. They'll say, no, this is what we agreed on working on. This is work that wasn't delivered in the last sprint. We have to definitely keep bringing this in. And it makes it really hard at times also to work with other schedules that may not fully align with that 2 week sprint. So if you have a marketing launch coming up that happens to hit on day 2 or day 3, you now have to make sure that all your work was delivered in 1 or 2 prior sprints, which can be great, but it can also be really stressful for certain teams as they get into those types of worlds. And they find themselves just constantly breaking the 2 week sprint that they adopted. Instead of actually following the 2 week sprint, they start massaging it or adjusting it, or even blowing up the sprint a couple of days in and starting fresh. So at its worst case, like I said, you end up with like these 2 week monsters, which just hurt the team across the board and undermine the actual premise of Scrum, which is that there's a high trust environment and self-organizing teams. And the way I often seen 2 week sprints come about is it's actually being mandated more from the top. So whether it's a head of engineering or a head of product, they're like, whichever way it comes about, it's less of that self-organizing nature, and it's really falling back into the, hey, this is how we're going to do it, and we're doing it for this, and just buy into it and make sure you want to do it. And so reasons that they tend to want to do 2 week sprints is you get more frequent demos, which in theory mean more ways to align the solution with the needs of the customer. You get more frequent retrospectives, which on the surface, great, you get more opportunities to recognize what's working, to call out what's not working, and run experiments to improve your performance. But at the worst, you just end up rehashing things over and over and over again, because a 2-week cycle is often not long enough to actually validate that certain things that you're adapting for how the team works will actually be working out, or implement those processes, particularly when it comes to teams that have to work across with other Scrum teams. And they also look for really more frequent progress data points. And that can often be like a chief operating officer wants that in really small startups, or as you get bigger, the head of a business unit. They just want to know that there's a repeatable machine that they can look at and measure and say, are you on track? Are you not on track? And at its best, that's great. You can recognize when you need to actually intervene in a sprint, or whether the team is devolving. But in many product scenarios, you're not able to be so deterministic, and it's better to be probabilistic in your approach. And so that's really why the point is that I'm trying to make is that if not 2 weeks, like there are alternatives.
And I've got a question. I want to just jump in here. Alberto, you want to ask your question?
Yeah, so one of the challenges that I wanted to ask a question about is implementing this process, right? So I think that this process is often one of the things that people do want to implement. Now, do you have any tips on how to implement that with a team that isn't experienced with it? Because I've seen it kind of go awry and like really disrupt, progress and just in general attitude about what it means. So this often happens where people are like, oh, Scrum's terrible because I tried to implement it and it didn't work out. So any tips on the best ways that you found that, hey, if I need to implement this process, what is some good tips there?
Yeah, so I mean, the first thing comes down to understanding what is the product that you're working on, what are the goals you're working on. There are different methodologies. Scrum definitely is one that fits certain scenarios. The first thing is really making sure that folks across the team have that common language and understand what you're going to mean when you say a sprint, when you say a retrospective, when you say a demo. What is the level of work that you expect to see in a demo? And really making sure that people don't, like, if you have a team that's working, that's producing product of value, and you have ways to already get that feedback loop going, you don't necessarily need to like slap in this crazy restrictive process of Scrum. And the worst cases I've seen are when there's like a highly functioning team, they're producing value, and there's other conversations happening by which like they're showing what they're producing. And then some technical PM or somebody else comes in and says, no, you have to sprints kick off on Monday, retros are on Friday. I don't care that you have kids and you guys want to be home at 3 p.m. on Friday. We're doing retros at 3, we're doing demos at 11. That's the worst case I've seen. So really it's making sure that the team understands it's for them, it's to benefit them, and it's to help them advance their work. And this can be easier when it's small teams. It becomes much harder when it's multiple teams across a company. So like when I was at Super Pedestrian, we have an e-commerce team working on what's the whole purchasing experience, buying experience, but they then have to tie into manufacturing to make sure that they're sending orders down to the line right, that when orders are in production, they're getting queued back up. So they're not independent. They have to work with that team at the line. Same way, the guys at the line have to actually work with the hardware team and the embedded software team to make sure that what products they're getting down to the line can actually be built, and that if they identify issues at the line, they can funnel that back in to the engineering process to fix that. And the embedded guys, 2 week sprints, like, God, they hated that idea. And typically they're looking at 4 weeks, 6 weeks, sometimes just really hard technical challenge. They're going to take 8 weeks, and there's no gate point along the way of, are you really on track? Are you not on track? It's a tough thing there. So recognizing it's not the right fit for all scenarios is certainly, I think, the first key. And recognizing that you need to first understand what's the team, what's the dynamic they're working on. Like, do they just need more rules to help them deliver, or are they already delivering? What's the product? Is it something as simple as a mobile app, in which case, sure, like totally, Scrum methodology is a perfect fit for smaller case things. Or are you actually launching a platform, right? If you're dealing with like crazy launches or just different teams, like it can be harder. I do think the rhythm of it and the cadence part of the conversations, the feedback loops is really critical for remote teams. So that's something I've done a lot of, is actually standing up remote teams or remote teams for existing companies. And without that ritual of how work flows into the team, it can actually be incredibly hard for a remote team to maintain that synergy of working as a team and producing things of value. So tips wise, first get a lay of the land, understand if it makes sense, understand what you've done before that worked or didn't work. If you have no idea what Scrum is, definitely go to some of the training classes that they offer or read up on online. You're going to see a lot of different takes with pros and cons. So definitely look at it from both angles. Don't just drink one cup of Kool-Aid and believe that it's the magic holy grail of how to produce things of value.
Cool. Looks like that's all the questions we have at the moment. Keep them coming in to the productmentor.com/live, as well as keep your questions coming into the live chat. And when they come in, we'll get them over to our speaker today. All right, Patrick, take it away.
Sure. So if you don't want to do 2-week sprints, or sorry, if you're challenging this premise, this like everyone thinks that 2-week sprints are the de facto. I've been in tons of different companies and everyone's like, yeah, it's 2 weeks. You really need to think of ways to challenge it and why. And so the big thing here is that you're not looking for one solution that is going to work forever at your team. You know, a 2-week sprint may actually be the right thing at different scenarios. A 1-week sprint can be the right way to go about delivering work at other times. And then other combinations or permutations, such as a 3-week sprint, then blended by a 1-week sprint. So the best way to know is really to focus on what you're trying to get done, focus on the stage you're in. So if you're, say, in the idea stage, right, the startup stage of a new product, and you are non-ambiguous, you've already done a lot of the market research, you've identified what it is you need to be bringing and building, you've even got your copy written out, you have your system architecture kind of ideated, then, you know, 1-week sprints are actually a great thing. Alternatively, if you like have a highly ambiguous thing, then the tightness of a 1-week sprint can just be incredibly draining on your team, burn you out. And so the goal is really to pick the cadence that gets you to reliably ship things of high value. And it's important to recognize that you need to figure out when you need to deliver value. You know, in some cases, you don't need to be showing things once a week. That may be too much. Maybe you need to actually bring customers in to interact with the product. And so you can only do that once a month, or maybe once a quarter if you're dealing with some of the higher end enterprise things where you do quarterly reviews with your customers. So it's really all about what is the product you're selling and whether or not it aligns with a certain period in time. What's the stage your company is in? Like, particularly if you're like in decline stage and you're just trying to find ways to cut out costs in your product, then, you know, you may not even have a full team anymore. You may have like one engineer whose job is just to go in now and again and maintain certain aspects. Or you may actually need to spin up a new team to figure out ways to sunset one product while replacing it with a new product. So that really kind of gets into what's the problem your team's working on, and recognizing that as a PM, ideally you get to see your product through every life cycle, or you can recognize that you're an expert or you get really good skill at parts of those life cycles, whether it's early on or later stages or mid-stage growth, that you recognize what's the right flow for that problem, and really that pace that you need at that time. It's also important to know how long your teams work together. Like if you're just standing up a team from scratch who've never worked together, they can often be more open to certain methods of working, and more routine can actually help them get off the ground, get each other to understand how they're working together, how they're going to make sure that at this specific time each day, they're going to take the 10 or 15 minutes to talk, to identify what their blockers are, in addition to any ongoing conversations they'll have throughout the days they're building. Whether or not your team is independent is incredibly critical, because you may actually need to account for the cadence happening in other teams that you're dependent on for getting work into your team. And so really paying attention to that. And so, your specific experiences will probably differ. And the biggest takeaway is just it's not one size fits all. The whole point of Scrum is really helping adapt, helping the team identify what works for them within, this rhythm of a sprint. So, things that I have seen work in different places, different times. I've seen, and this one's actually kind of odd, this 3-week and then 1 week and 3 week, in that I have not seen this be a norm. I haven't seen a lot of other PMs that I know implement this or other teams adopt this. But this is one that I've seen work, and I'll talk about why I've seen it work later. And it's definitely, I've seen it work in an independent team. And it really is useful in cases where you need that longer pause to really help validate that what you shipped is bringing value. You can't just do it in one quick demo. Maybe you need to actually do a post-launch period with it, and you don't want that post-launch period to be running into your next sprint. I've also seen the 1 week sprints work, but typically up to 3 months. So like a perfect case in point for this, about 5 years ago back at Social Bicycles, we determined we needed to create a new product, like completely both tied to but independent from our core product, that was direct to consumer. It was a mobile app intended to help gather data in cities around how people were using bicycles, where they wanted better bike infrastructure. And we were using this for a couple of different reasons. One, because we thought the apps out there weren't really geared towards what it was to be a commuter cyclist. Two, because we wanted to help cities get data to create better bike infrastructure, which would position us to now understand where bike infrastructure was in a city, how people moved through that city, so that we could actually pitch that city on having bike share and have us serve them with bike share, independent of there being any fixed RFP and a contract. And so, there had been a period of time about 3 months where there was just an idea being bounced around of, hey, maybe we need this. Then a 4-week period of, okay, like really dive in. What's the competition? Does it make sense? What does this actually look like in terms of a story if we were to launch this at a marketing launch in X months? And then like creating that backlog, and a really rigorous, tight backlog, defining things explicitly. And luckily being able to do that in part because we could leverage much of our existing software and just repurpose it for this. And so doing that, we then kicked it off and we said, okay, 1 week sprints. Every sprint, every Friday, we're going to be showing something of value. And the point of that was that we wanted to get to be able to launch something that brought value to customers as fast as possible. And we were targeting 3 months out. We actually managed to get something of initial value out at 2 months. So just 8 weeks, 8 sprints in. And it was in part because we were really getting that quick check every single time, quick checks on design. Does this actually work? Do people understand what this symbology means on the map? Do they understand this flow of how to start a trip? Do they like it? Would they prefer that it was something more like Moves, where they just have it in your pocket and it starts your trip for you and measures that you're riding a bicycle? So like definitely in the startup idea stage, when you've gotten past the what is it you want to build and that, and you really want to just fly, tight intervals can be great, can be incredibly powerful for a team. I've also technically seen the 2 week sprints work. Actually, let me go back on this one. So the downside to the 1 week sprints is that after that 3 month period, we kept trying to run with the 1 week sprints, but we had burned through the really well-defined backlog. We were now getting into more ambiguous questions about which vein of features should we be pursuing to best bring value? How do we make sure that like this city's concerns are addressed versus cities 1, 2, and 3? And how do we make sure that city 0 has 2 million people, which is 4x what we have in the other 3 cities, but those other 3 cities are willing to pay us? How do we balance out what value is to us, both near term and long term? And so what we found was that the 1 week sprints actually started burning out other parts of our machinery. If you think of the company and what we're doing as a manufacturing line, PMs weren't able to keep up with the definition of the product and the definition of what was going to be of value to the customer. Design wasn't able to actually keep designs flowing in for the engineers to work on. And so we basically blew that up and shifted Cadence to a different pace. And we actually switched over to a 2 week cycle. And again, we only ran that one for a certain length of time, but we ran it in a length of time where we recognized that, it's okay now that we're not doing it every single week. 2 weeks feels right, 2 times a month. What we often did in that case actually is we had multiple customers that we'd be speaking to. And so for the customer, their cadence actually was once a month. But for the team, they'd be presenting to customers and presenting out the work every 2 weeks. And we thought that could continue on for a really long time, but what we found was that it actually resulted in some stagnant work where the engineers just got into a routine of, okay, well, this is what I'm doing and this. And it ended up at, I think basically we re-entered a stage when we should have been going back to 1 week sprints where we needed a tighter interval of feedback, but the team wasn't willing to accommodate that because they were now locked into this idea of 2 weeks. And so, the CEO would come in and say, hey, I need to see this on Friday. And they'd be like, well, that's great, but our demo is the following Friday and we're not going to have anything to show you this Friday. And just resulting in a lot of friction and kind of detriment to the team in terms of how the executives now viewed them. They started thinking of them as lazy, not able to deliver, and really caused a lot of problems there. And so 2 weeks can work, but try not to make it the thing you're doing all the time forever.
So we got a question just now in from Andrew. Let me hand it over to Andrew to ask his question.
Yeah, thanks. So I really enjoyed the idea actually of what I saw is you had a 3 week and a 1 week. So you had a 3 week sprint and a 1 week to prep. That's actually surprisingly a bit novel from what I've seen. And now you're on 2 weeks. So what I wanted to ask was, our team struggles with the planning piece and then the execution. So do you plan within the 2 weeks? Like, is it formalized that they spend, let's say, 2 days up front? Or just as you're showing, do you typically customize depending on what the team needs? So if they're having issues planning, you're doing a week of planning and then a 2 week sprint. What's been the most productive way for you kind of help them manage those 2 time horizons?
So kind of both. So to your earlier point of like, is that planning happening inside? At its best case, yes, we've done where planning is actually happening often at the end of one sprint before we flow into the next. And so we anticipate what the work is coming. We've adapted to, instead of just being like, okay, this is the work for 6 weeks out, new work has come in, new work has actually pushed other things down, but that new work is still a little bit ambiguous. The engineers haven't gotten time to go into it. So what we ended up actually doing at one of my last places was starting to implement tasking. And so tasking is where you have a story, you have like acceptance criteria, but then what are the steps you actually have to do to make that happen? And assigning time blocks and value to that so you can understand, okay, actually I need to stand up a server for this. And while, yes, it's only a 1 point story, it's incredibly simple, I need a lot of time actually this time to stand this up. And so really helping them understand that, great, it looks like it's only 20 points, but those 20 points actually have a lot more work in it this time, and whether or not you can really take that in. The 3+1, and I'll talk to also how we did that with interdependent teams. Really that 1 week pause has been useful for when it's kind of like overlapping. So what I didn't get to put in here, or didn't really feel strong enough in putting it in here, is that you can actually have one process flowing into another. And that's what I've seen actually work best. So when you can have the PM who's not, like if you're a really small team, it's challenging because your PM has to be doing the strategy, has to be doing the business, has to be doing the fit, and sometimes marketing, while also really making sure the engineers are delivering and serving that technical role. And that burns a lot of PMs out when they have to balance that, or it just results in teams shipping things that when they ship it, people go, wait, that's not what I wrote a spec for. That's not what I expected to be built. And there wasn't a process for the engineers to really help validate that earlier on. And so kind of depends on the team. As you evolve, like, hey, you get to a really huge company, you may end up with a PM who's writing the business spec and the brief, and then another person comes in to really help digest that into engineering terms and figure out with the engineers how you go about building that, making sure that that now comes back. And so that's where I've seen that 3+1 start working more, is that you break up that routine. So basically, whether you do a 1 week and you're just like sprinting really fast and burning out, or a 2 week where it kind of starts feeling like a plod, or 4 weeks, which is great in hardware, but if you're software, you're like, Jesus, can I see something? it breaks it up. Like when you have the same routine happening over and over and over again, it becomes monotonous and you actually end up becoming inefficient in the way you're doing. So you could do 2+1. I haven't tried it yet, but I have had friends in Europe who have done that with some of their shops where they have like one team that's doing 2, hands off into another week where 1 or 2 engineers pair with some folks on QA, and then any work that comes out of that, like, hey, there's actually not quite implemented right, it can flow back into the 2 weeks versus they ship it. And then you have to wait for a customer to say, hey guys, you had a major oversight here and there's a huge bug in your software. Personally, I like to do more of an XP model where every single thing we ship is pretty tight, pretty perfect, very tiny, and we can build atop it. Unfortunately, that's not really common, and it's also not something that most engineers know, so it takes a lot longer to stand that up. And so I'm hoping to get there at Udacity, but I only parachuted in 5 months ago, and I'm just happy that we're shipping things of value versus when I got here and folks were like, what the hell is that? And the engineer's like, this is what you asked for.
Yeah, totally.
So.
Thanks. Great. And next question comes from Anthony, and Anthony is asking, how much time should a person expect to spend on Scrum Master activities for new teams?
How much time do you have to spend on it? Because unfortunately, it's something that can eat up really all the time you're going to give to it. Both training people, doing the processes you need in advance. Like, okay, simplest thing, say you've got it ironed out and you're looking at maybe a 1-hour session for backlog grooming that you fit in, which is not necessarily part of the sprint process, but is really fruitful because you have a fast growing backlog to make sure that you're grooming it in advance. Maybe another hour to 2 hours for the initial sprint planning where you have to negotiate what's the right thing to bring in, particularly if you have one team serving multiple business needs, which definitely happens at smaller startups. Your daily Scrum stand-ups can, if you're really good, they can be done in 5 minutes. If you're not, and with newer teams, as folks learn that, you know, not to just ramble and not to make it a social thing, worst case, they can go for 30 minutes, and that just eats up 2.5 hours of time a week, and that's a terrible thing for your team to be doing. Retros, actually, you really want to give some more time. I've seen teams do them in as short as 30 minutes, and those are ones that, you know, are doing a 2-week cycle. Other folks will say, you know, actually it's better, we need longer conversations. We want to do a 90-minute one, but we'll do it every second sprint. And then you get the demos, and demos, you know, happens if you have stuff to ship, to show. And so if you have something to ship every single time, you know, that's potentially an hour longer if you end up presenting to executives who derail your meeting and your conversation and end up really down in the weeds and don't know how to like put things in a parking lot to talk about later. And I've definitely seen that as a trend at smaller companies, that the executives are just like, they're already 3-4 months out in their head. And so when they see like these tiny things, they like get way down in the weeds, and it can be incredibly disruptive for the engineering team, because then actually afterwards, the engineers are going to group up and start bitching about the executives instead of figuring out what that was and why. So, you know, at its worst case, you can easily lose a working day a week for all your engineering team. Best case, you're down to a half a day. But it can be okay provided you get the value out of it, right? So if you were able to run a split test and say, okay, the same exact team runs here without any of this process, and the same exact team runs here with the process, wish you could do it, you really can't. But typically the team with at least some process is going to outperform the team that's just kind of muddying through. But again, it depends on the team. You know, some engineers need very granular briefs to work off of, and other engineers just need to know the spirit of the feature story, and they'll find ways to validate actually as they're doing the work and bringing it back.
All right, that looks like all the questions we have right now. Keep them coming into the productmentor.com/live, as well as posting the live chat on YouTube. With that said, back to you, Patrick.
Sure. So you have that 3+1 that can work for, and this works for interdependent teams. And so the reason why is that shared pause. So whether all of the teams are running on this cycle, or if only some of the teams are running on a shared cycle and the others are running on a slightly tangential one, it doesn't really matter. But this type of process where there's a shared pause to really consolidate. So whether it's give an example. So if you're working on some new embedded code, it may take 3 weeks just to get something out there. But that embedded code is useless without actually interacting at the server side or passing messages over into, say, a mobile app or a client side. And if you just keep running each team independent, you often don't, unless you take an entire sprint to make sure that things are working together, you're going to end up with team A saying that team B built it wrong, or team B saying that team A built it wrong, and just lots of friction in there. Whereas if you engineer in this actual pause for them to work together, to think of themselves as that larger team for the company, a lot of that friction that gets pushed out instead it gets handled and resolved, and the team thinks about this as something. They think about the people who are dependent on them and who they're dependent on as part of their larger team. And so the way I like to think about this is it's actually it's not, so there's Scrum of Scrums, which is a whole alignment for Scrum teams. This has some parallels to it, but works in smaller settings where it's really each Scrum team is an agent in a larger Scrum team. And so that 1 week period is actually time to help align those teams so that during the next 3 weeks, each individual team, as with the individual contributors in a specific Scrum team, they can go off and just deliver. They can go off and focus on what they're doing before that next gated checkpoint. And so to the point of the cadence, right? You want to make sure that you're not just doing a lot of work up front, picking a pace that you think is right or that happens to be working perfectly right now at this time, and not rechecking yourself. The whole point of Scrum is that you're consistently going back and validating that what you're doing is working. And that applies to the Scrum method and your cadence as much as to the actual nitty gritty of, hey, is this particular way of building this particular app working? And is this team communicating correctly? And the retro side, you're going to cover what's working, but that tends to be inside the team. And it's really important to recognize that the Scrum process itself can actually put your team at risk of not functioning well within the rest of your organization, or it can put your team at risk of burning out. And when you're a smaller startup, or even when you're a large company, you really can't afford to just burn through people. You have so much knowledge built up in them. You've done so much work to train them on processes. They get the value prop of your company that for them to leave simply because of something as stupid as being asked to deliver value every week is just silly. And so it's important and incumbent on you as a product manager who's really responsible for these teams, for both protecting them and guiding them in this capacity, to raise questions with them of whether they're on the right pace at that time. And keep in mind that it's really, it is a relay race where you're consistently handing off to yourself or to another team to carry on, and that, all out sprints will only burn you out. And so don't do that, as well as, rhythm and regular, too regular, and you actually end up not performing as well as you could be.
I had a question. How do you, I guess I'm still trying to wrap my brain around some of the pauses. What are some of the, I know we talked about a little bit of planning during the pause. What are some other activities during the pause? And I guess the follow-up is, you touched on this a little bit, is how do you communicate to stakeholders? What best practices have you seen communicating to stakeholders why to take this pause? Because a lot of what I encounter is engineers are idle. This is costing us a lot of money.
Yeah. You will definitely hear that from folks who may not understand the engineering side. So case in point, right? Udacity, my team, we do quarterly offsites where the entire team, because my entire team's remote. So we do quarterly offsites where for a week, the entire team comes together. And at its worst case, we don't write any code during that time. And so there's no output visually in terms of, new feature set coming. And people go, what the hell are you doing? And then I have to communicate to them, actually, hey, I'm making sure that we're perfectly aligned as a tight unit right now so that when they fly back out in our remote, there's no questions from them about what's the value proposition we're working towards, what are the key architecture pieces? And best case, we get to actually dive into some hackathons that are actually quite hard to run remotely, and you can do that in person. And so, the last one, we did a hackathon and some engineers put together an entire notification system in one day, something that had been sitting in the back of their mind for a while, and others hadn't really even been thinking of. Like, it's like an item, yeah, we'll get to it someday type thing. And we're just like, it can't be that hard. Let's just take a crack at it. Now we have a model that we'll run with in the future, so that when we do get there, we've already done a lot of the work, the planning, the thinking, how might we do this, so that there's value. So engineers being idle, I think, is commonly said, but often misunderstood. I think the work from handing off. So if you're hand off and wait like that, do work, hand off and wait for feedback. That's actually the biggest risk I see in the workflow processes for teams. And so that really involves having somebody who's going to bat to make sure that things aren't waiting, or making sure that knowledge is spread across a team. Because if there's one engineer who's the only one who knows how to do this certain thing, then you're always going to be waiting if you have to put work into that person.
Could you expand more on some of the activities to do like during a pause? Like, I know there's like, I guess the hackathon idea, or sort of treat it as like a 1 week sprint to maybe take care of a bunch of little things, but other ideas?
Yeah. So definitely some cross-team work that may or may not happen, and also time for education. So, super pedestrian, for instance, we had our embedded team, we had our systems team, we had our e-commerce guys, we had our mobile app, which was actually like Android and iOS, and at one point in time, like, they weren't really closely talking, even though like they sat right next to each other. You got design, and so there's definitely chances for a need for, basically, as one team goes and finds solutions in a certain area, those may or may not come back to other parts of the company, other parts of those teams, and definitely at demos and other things. So learning sessions, I think, are something key to do during that time. It doesn't have to be a long thing. It'd be like one day for that, where you start pairing up certain teams and doing things that aren't necessarily a hackathon, but saying, hey, there's a feature set that is on here, but it's ambiguous. Can we make it less ambiguous so that we feel comfortable taking this work in during the next time? That's something else I've seen be really useful during that period. In companies where you're producing something that can actually, like, you have a chance of getting people out in front of the customer, getting your engineers and designers and others to actually see how the customers are using the product and getting value from it, I think is actually really, really important, because you'll get, let's be clear, like, engineers aren't just supposed to take something and like spit it out. Like, you want them applying their full brain power, the same as you are, to what's your business base, what's your problem, how to best bring value, and build things in such a way that they scale, or that they scale just enough to get you that next stage. Classic thing, if a company's been around for 6 months, try not to assume it's going to be around for 2 years. Like, most things will last as long as they've already been existing, give or take. And so you want to make sure that you really get people invested in it. And too often I've seen engineers that don't become fully invested in the products they're working on. And so I think those pauses can also be chances to give them time to do that.
So it looks like that's all the questions we have today. Thank you to our speaker, Patrick Hoffman, for his talk on sprints, finding and maintaining the right cadence for your team and product. Senior Product Manager of Enterprise over at Udacity. And also, as always, the presentation will be posted to our SlideShare channel. And a big thank you for me, Jeremy Horn, the product guy, and to everyone else who joined us today in the Product Mentor. And don't forget, if you're interested in being a product mentor, like today's speaker, Patrick, to people of all sorts all around the world, please visit theproductmentor.com and sign up today. And also, if you're looking to fill a new product job with a great product person, visit our very own free for all job board at theproductjobs.com. And with all that said, see ya, bye, and see you next time.